Saint Alphonsus Maria de Liguori was born on September 27, 1696, in the city of Marianella, near Naples, in the Kingdom of Naples, Italy. The firstborn son of a noble family, Alphonsus grew up surrounded by culture, discipline, and faith. His father, Giuseppe de Liguori, was a highly esteemed naval officer, and his mother, Anna Cavalieri, was a profoundly devout woman who, from an early age, instilled in her son a love for God and the Church. The education he received combined academic rigor with Christian spirituality. From a very young age, Alphonsus showed uncommon intelligence and great memorization ability. He spoke several languages, possessed impressive logical reasoning, and had a special sensitivity for the arts, especially music and painting. At the same time, he was a disciplined and obedient youth, accustomed to the order and honor that his social position required. His father desired for him a prestigious career that would unite family honor and stability. At 16, Alphonsus had already graduated in civil and canon law from the University of Naples, becoming one of the youngest lawyers in Europe. His skill in defending cases was remarkable, and he quickly gained fame in the courts. Despite his youth, his seriousness and clarity of argument earned the respect of even the most experienced judges. For his family, the future seemed promising. However, Alphonsus's life began to change when he started to perceive the flaws and injustices of the legal world. Although he was upright and honest, he often witnessed manipulations, corruption, and inequalities that harmed the poorest and most defenseless. His Christian sensitivity could not accommodate this reality, and it began to generate in him a deep spiritual unease. The decisive moment occurred in 1723, when Alphonsus lost a court case that had seemed securely won. The circumstances were so unjust that he clearly saw the vanity and fragility of human glory. Upon leaving the courtroom, he uttered the words that would mark his life. "O deceitful world, now I know you. Farewell, courts." This phrase sealed the end of his career as a lawyer and the beginning of his walk toward the priesthood. Shortly thereafter, Alphonsus decided to consecrate his life entirely to God. His decision was met with some resistance from his father, who had invested much in his son's education. However, over time, the family accepted the priestly vocation, recognizing that it was a profound and genuine calling. Alphonsus then entered the seminary and began his theological formation. During his studies, he stood out for the depth and clarity of his thought. His love for sacred scripture and moral theology was evident, and he dedicated long hours to study and prayer. At the same time, he did not distance himself from pastoral life. He visited the sick, helped the poor, and took part in popular missions in needy communities. In 1726, at the age of 30, Alphonsus was ordained a priest. From the outset, he committed himself to serve, especially the poorest and most abandoned. His way of preaching was simple, direct, and deeply moving, reaching both intellectuals and peasants. He believed that the truth of the gospel should be announced clearly and accessibly to all. Alphonsus's pastoral experience led him to realize that many souls drifted away from God due to a lack of religious instruction and spiritual support. He sadly observed ignorance about the sacraments and the doctrine of the faith, especially among the humblest. This realization would soon guide his future works and foundations. In addition to being a preacher, Alphonsus was also an indefatigable missionary. He traveled on foot or horseback over long distances, bringing the word of God to small villages, rural areas, and marginalized regions. He did not limit himself to preaching. He heard confessions for hours, gave counsel, organized catecheses, and encouraged devotion to Our Lady. During these missions, he deepened his Marian devotion, especially to Our Lady of Perpetual Help, who would later become the patroness of his congregation. For Alphonsus, Mary was the loving mother who led sinners to Christ and interceded for all spiritual and material needs. His fame as a preacher grew, but Alphonsus did not seek personal recognition. On the contrary, he feared that vanity would distance him from evangelical humility. He maintained an intense life of prayer, with long periods of adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, where he found strength for his ministry. At the same time, Alphonsus began to devote himself to writing. He realized that books could reach those he could not visit personally. His first writings were aimed at catechesis and the moral instruction of the faithful. Later, his works would become references for priests and lay people worldwide. Gradually, his desire to create a more structured work began to grow. He wanted to found a congregation whose principal mission would be to evangelize the poor and forgotten, especially in rural areas. This inspiration would mature over time and become a reality within a few years. In this initial phase of his ministry, Alphonsus also faced trials and misunderstandings. Some criticized him for his simple language, accusing him of not being scholarly enough. However, he remained faithful to the method he considered most effective, speaking to people's hearts, not just to their reason. Living closely with the people allowed Alphonsus to see firsthand the material and spiritual difficulties of the humblest. He understood that evangelization should be accompanied by concrete acts of charity. Therefore, he organized collections to help needy families and encouraged wealthier faithful to practice almsgiving. His spirituality was deeply rooted in God's mercy. He believed that no one was lost forever, provided there was sincere repentance and trust in divine grace. This vision permeated his entire life and work, making him an apostle of hope for sinners. Parallel to his missionary work, Alphonsus maintained an austere life. He fasted frequently, practiced penance, and slept little, dedicating a large part of the night to prayer and study. His discipline was the fruit of an intense love for Christ and a burning desire for holiness. Alphonsus's pastoral zeal also manifested in the administration of the sacraments. He was known as a patient and merciful confessor, capable of guiding with prudence and firmness, without ever losing tenderness. Many turned to him to find peace and reconciliation with God. The decision to found a missionary congregation grew ever stronger in his heart. Alphonsus realized that he could not alone reach all the needy regions. It was necessary to gather men with the same ideal, willing to live evangelical poverty and dedicate themselves completely to proclaiming the gospel. By the end of this first phase of his life, St. Alphonsus was fully convinced that his mission was to bring Christ to the most abandoned. This conviction would lead him to found, shortly, the Congregation of the Most Holy Redeemer, which would forever change the missionary landscape of the Church. The inspiration to found a missionary congregation began to take shape in St. Alphonsus's heart around 1730. He perceived that in the rural and mountainous areas of the Kingdom of Naples, many communities were completely spiritually abandoned. Few priests went to these places, and the population lived in religious ignorance without frequent access to the sacraments. In 1731, during a mission in the region of Scala, a striking experience confirmed this inspiration. Alphonsus met a group of shepherds and peasants who asked him to return and teach them the Christian doctrine. They lived in isolation and did not even have a priest to celebrate Mass regularly. This reality touched his heart deeply and gave rise to the conviction that God was calling him to care for these most abandoned. After discernment and much prayer, Alphonsus began gathering companions with the same missionary zeal. The project faced resistance from some clergy and even ecclesiastical authorities, who saw the idea as too bold. Nevertheless, Alphonsus remained steadfast, trusting that if it were God's work, it would prosper. Finally, on November 9, 1732, in the city of Scala, Alphonsus founded the Congregation of the Most Holy Redeemer, also known as the Redemptorists. The congregation's mission was clear: to follow the example of Jesus Christ, proclaiming the good news to the poor. The Redemptorist charism united simple and accessible preaching with a deep life of prayer. The initial community was small, and the first years were full of difficulties. Many who began the journey alongside Alphonsus eventually gave up, whether from fatigue or the precarious living conditions. The missions required long travels, enduring cold, hunger, and the rejection of some places. But Alphonsus remained serene, sustained by his faith. The Redemptorists organized popular missions that lasted several weeks. They included daily preaching, catechesis for adults and children, confessions, adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, and Marian celebrations. The method was simple but profoundly effective, as it transformed hearts and renewed entire communities. Alphonsus's missionary style valued direct contact with people. He and his companions visited homes, talked with families, and took an interest in their difficulties. They did not preach only from the pulpit, but walked with the people, sharing joys and sufferings. This closeness generated great trust and opened doors for the gospel. Despite fatigue and exhausting journeys, Alphonsus maintained a rigorous spiritual discipline. The day began with long prayers and ended with meditation and an examination of conscience. He believed that without prayer, the mission became sterile. For this reason, he insisted that his confrères cultivate a deep spiritual life. In their missions, Alphonsus gave special attention to the Eucharist and devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. He encouraged frequent communion, something uncommon at the time, and promoted the practice of Marian novenas. For him, Mary was the surest path to Jesus, and thus he recommended constant recourse to the Mother of God's intercession. The fame of his mission spread rapidly, and soon the congregation began receiving requests to operate in new regions. However, resources were limited, and Alphonsus had to make careful choices so as not to compromise the missionary's spiritual life. He preferred to serve fewer communities, but in a deeper and more lasting way. In addition to missionary work, Alphonsus began writing books to help both missionaries and the faithful. Among them, the classic Visits to the Blessed Sacrament and to Mary Most Holy stood out, becoming a reference work in Catholic devotional life. With simple and warm language, the book encouraged intimacy with Jesus in the Eucharist. His concern for Christian morality also led him to write on moral theology. Alphonsus perceived that many confessors were excessively rigorous, driving penitents away from God's mercy, while others were excessively lax, minimizing the gravity of sin. He proposed a balanced path called moderate rigorism, which united firmness in truth with pastoral tenderness. The first Redemptorist missions produced notable spiritual fruits. Entire communities returned to sacramental practice, family reconciliations occurred, and the Christian spirit was renewed. This confirmed to Alphonsus that the work was dear to God and should continue despite difficulties. Over time, the congregation grew and became better structured. New missionaries joined the work, and religious houses were founded to serve as mission bases. However, Alphonsus did not grow complacent. He was always seeking new ways to reach hearts distanced from the faith. Not everyone, however, viewed his work favorably. Some ecclesiastical authorities and members of the nobility considered Alphonsus's methods too simple for the dignity of the church. Others criticized him for dedicating so much time to the poor instead of focusing on wealthy and influential parishes. Alphonsus, though, remained faithful to the call he had received. Financial difficulties were constant. Often, missionaries lived with the bare minimum, trusting in divine providence. Alphonsus used to say that God provides when his work is at stake, and indeed, sustenance for the most urgent needs was never lacking. The austere life of the Redemptorist missionaries was also a form of witness. They wore simple habits, ate little, and worked hard. This coherence between preaching and life attracted respect even from non-Christians who saw in them a living and sincere faith. Gradually, the Redemptorist spirituality began taking shape. Love for the Eucharist, Marian devotion, proximity to the poor, and missionary zeal. This set of elements formed the basis of a charism that remains alive to this day. Intense work, however, was starting to wear down Alphonsus's health. He suffered from chronic problems, such as arthritis and visual difficulties, but he continued to travel and preach whenever possible. His physical endurance was sustained by the spiritual strength he found in prayer. Even amid limitations, Alphonsus multiplied his efforts for the congregation to gain official recognition by the Church. In 1749, he received papal approval, which gave security and stability to the missionary work he had begun in Scala years before. In 1762, St. Alphonsus was over 65, physically weakened by illness and worn out by intense missionary work. To his surprise, Pope Clement XIII appointed him Bishop of the Diocese of Sant'Agata de' Goti in southern Italy. Alphonsus did not desire the episcopate. He preferred to remain directly in the missions. However, after resisting for a while, he accepted the appointment in obedience to God's will and the Church's. Upon taking over the diocese, Alphonsus found a flock in a concerning situation. Many priests lived in a lax manner. Catechesis for the people was scarce, and the sacraments were neglected. The moral life of the populace was also weakened, marked by vices, injustices, and little religious practice. He realized that arduous and profound work would be necessary to restore the faith. From the start, Alphonsus applied the same method he used in his missions: proximity to the people, clarity in doctrine, and intense sacramental life. He personally visited parishes, organized retreats for the clergy, encouraged frequent confession, and promoted regular communion. His simple yet firm presence won everyone's respect. One of his greatest concerns was the formation of the clergy. Alphonsus knew that a poorly formed priest compromised the entire spiritual life of his community. Therefore, he organized courses and training for priests, insisting on the need for study, prayer, and exemplary life. He also encouraged simple, well-prepared homilies that reached the faithful's hearts. In the field of moral theology, Alphonsus became a true master. His work, Moral Theology, was the fruit of decades of pastoral experience and deep reflection. He sought a balance between the rigor of the law and God's mercy, always guided by truth and charity. His approach opposed extremes. He combated both inflexible rigorism and permissive laxism. The hallmark of his moral theology was the aim of saving souls. For Alphonsus, the confessor should be like a doctor who heals wounds, not like a judge who only condemns. He said that a priest who drives a penitent away with unjust harshness might lose a soul forever. At the same time, he warned against the danger of minimizing sin and the need for conversion. Besides his moral work, Alphonsus wrote spiritual books that became classics of Catholic literature. Among them, The Practice of the Love of Jesus Christ, which deals with the union of the soul with God through love and total surrender to His will, stands out. Another book of great impact was The Glories of Mary, where he defended and explained Marian devotion in a profound and tender way. The Glories of Mary was born of his missionary experience. Alphonsus realized that many sinners approach God more easily through the intercession of the Virgin Mary. He gathered examples, prayers, and reflections that showed Mary's role in salvation history and in each Christian's life. This work strengthened Marian devotion worldwide. However, the episcopate was not without suffering. Alphonsus faced opposition from some priests who did not accept his reforms and criticism from civil authorities upset by his fight against corruption and injustice. His firmness in defending the faith also put him at odds with certain theological currents of the time. Difficulties did not come only from outside. His health continued to deteriorate. He suffered from severe arthritis that deformed his bones and from vision problems that nearly blinded him. In his last years as bishop, he had to be carried in a chair to visit parishes and celebrate Mass. Nevertheless, he kept a joyful spirit and trust in divine providence. In 1775, already 79 and in very poor health, Alphonsus asked Pope Pius VI to leave the bishopric. His request was granted, and he was able to return to community life with the Redemptorists, though he no longer had the strength to participate actively in missions. Even so, he continued writing and giving spiritual counsel to his confreres. The last years of his life were marked by a painful misunderstanding, an internal dispute in the Congregation of the Most Holy Redeemer over certain rule changes reached Rome. Alphonsus, very old and almost blind, signed a document believing it was in accordance with the Pope's will, but the text had in fact been altered by others. This led to his official exclusion from the very congregation he had founded. This episode was a great cross for Alphonsus. He suffered deeply but bore no grudge. On the contrary, he offered the suffering to God and continued praying for the congregation's members. Only after his death was his innocence in the episode fully recognized, and he was reinstated as founder. Despite all suffering, Alphonsus maintained serenity and faith to the end. He said that trials were signs of God's love, and that the true disciple of Christ must be ready to carry the cross. His interior life remained intense, nourished by prayer and contemplation. In this final phase, he produced even more spiritual works. He wrote reflections on Christ's passion, meditations for retreats, and texts on the life of prayer. His last written words reveal the heart of a man who lived entirely to love and serve God. In his old age, Alphonsus also devoted himself to hearing the confessions of those who sought him, even with his hearing weakened. The patience and gentleness with which he treated each penitent impressed everyone. He saw himself as a father who welcomes his children, not as a distant judge. Devotion to Our Lady continued to be the source of his spiritual strength. Alphonsus prayed the Rosary daily, meditated on Marian mysteries, and recommended to all that they trust in Mary as the advocate of sinners. Until his last days, he kept a small image of the Virgin, which he kissed tenderly. In the end of his life, almost totally physically incapacitated, Alphonsus dedicated himself only to prayer, to celebrating Mass with assistance, and to writing whenever his strength allowed. He himself said that at that moment his mission was to pray for the Church and for the missionaries who continue the work. Saint Alphonsus Maria de Liguori's final years were lived in intense union with God despite severe physical limitations. He was practically blind, suffered from deforming arthritis that forced him to remain almost always seated, and felt constant pain. Yet he did not complain, offering everything as a sacrifice for the salvation of souls and the good of the Church. Even without strength to preach or travel, Alphonsus wrote whenever possible. He dictated texts to his assistants, producing deep reflections on spiritual life, prayer, and Marian devotion. Many of these works would be published after his death and become a source of inspiration for generations of faithful and priests. In the last months of his life, his frailty increased considerably. He could no longer celebrate Mass alone, needing help from other priests. However, his devotion and recollection were so profound that those attending the celebration felt they were in the presence of a saint. His words and prayers were filled with tenderness and fervor. Despite the pains and injustices he suffered, especially for having been formally removed from the congregation he founded, Alphonsus never ceased praying for the Redemptorists. In his heart, there was never room for resentment. There was only love and the desire for his work to remain faithful to the gospel and the poorest. On the night of July 31st, 1787, Alphonsus entered into agony. His confreres gathered in prayer around his bed. Even debilitated, he made the sign of the cross and murmured words of total surrender to God and the Virgin Mary. In the early hours of August 1st, 1787, at 91 years of age, he gave his soul to the Creator, passing away peacefully. The news of his death spread quickly and caused great commotion. Many faithful priests and religious came to venerate his body and to show affection and gratitude for the one who had devoted his entire life to the salvation of souls. His reputation for holiness was already recognized long before his passing. The process of Alphonsus's beatification began a few years after his death. Testimonies of miracles attributed to his intercession and the impact of his missionary and theological work propelled the Church's official recognition. On September 15, 1816, Pope Pius VII proclaimed Saint Alphonsus Maria de Liguori blessed. Canonization took place on May 26, 1839, under Pope Gregory XVI, who highlighted Alphonsus as an example of a zealous pastor, master of spiritual life, and defender of balanced Christian morality. His fame continued to grow, and his works began to be studied in Catholic seminaries and universities worldwide. In 1871, Pope Pius IX proclaimed him a Doctor of the Church, recognizing the depth and relevance of his theological writings, especially in moral theology. Saint Alphonsus is still regarded today as the patron of confessors and moral theologians for his ability to unite fidelity to truth with compassion for the sinner. Beyond his theological work, Alphonsus's legacy lives on through the congregation of the Most Holy Redeemer, which has spread across all continents. Redemptorist missionaries continue to preach popular missions, visit abandoned communities, and bring the word of God to the poorest, faithful to the founder's charism. Devotion to Saint Alphonsus also remains alive among the faithful. Many seek his intercession for spiritual strength, moral discernment, and courage in the face of difficulties. His emphasis on prayer, especially on adoration of the Blessed Sacrament and devotion to Mary, continues to inspire Christians worldwide. The work, The Glories of Mary in particular, remains one of the most widely read Marian books in history. It is constantly reprinted and translated, serving as a guide for prayer and meditation for those who wish to grow in love for the Mother of God. Alphonsus viewed Mary as a safe refuge for all, especially for sinners. His phrase, "He who prays is saved, he who does not pray is condemned," synthesizes his teaching on the importance of prayer. For him, praying was not merely an optional devotion, but a vital necessity to keep the soul united to God and persevere in grace. In the field of morality, his influence remains alive. The Church recognizes in Alphonsus a model of how to deal with complex moral questions without abandoning fidelity to truth or mercy toward the faithful. His doctrine is still a reference in contemporary moral theology studies. The personal example of Saint Alphonsus is also a powerful testimony. He showed that it is possible to unite a life of intense pastoral activity with a profound interior life, that it is possible to be simultaneously a missionary, writer, bishop, and man of prayer, and that fidelity to Christ requires perseverance to the end. Today, his tomb in Pagani, Italy, is a place of pilgrimage and devotion. There thousands of faithful seek his intercession, give thanks for graces received, and renew their commitment to living according to the gospel. The atmosphere of peace and recollection felt in this sanctuary reflects the holy life he led. Saint Alphonsus Maria de Liguori remains a beacon for the Church, especially in times of moral confusion and distancing from faith. His life and writings invite all Christians to live with firmness in truth and tenderness in charity. always remembering that the ultimate goal is the salvation of souls. The liturgical feast of Saint Alphonsus is celebrated on August 1st, the date of his entry into heaven. On this day, the Church invites the faithful to remember his life and ask for his intercession, so that we too may be missionaries of Christ's love, each in our own reality. Concluding his story, we keep the testimony of a man who, even in the greatest trials, never lost sight of the supreme goal: to love and serve God above all. And that is why, centuries later, Saint Alphonsus Maria de Liguori continues to speak to the heart of the Church and to inspire those who wish to follow Christ's path with fidelity.